So hi and welcome again. This is towards more equitable open science events, assessing tools, techniques, and frameworks for inclusion exclusions, which is part of our Event Fund seminar series. In terms of our agenda today, we're going to jump right into presentations by our speakers, and hopefully that'll leave us ample time for Q&A. We're really lucky. I'm so excited to be able to host an amazing panel of experts who've kindly agreed to share their perspectives with us today around evaluating our events for inclusions and exclusions. Yes, coming up with an invite list is one part of deciding who's included, who's excluded, but there are other really seemingly mundane, everyday kinds of decisions that are also really key deciding factors. So I hope from today that we'll take away that even these kind of seemingly small event planning decisions, you know, what language an event is in, what technology platform you use, how you maybe cost the fees, these are important moments of inclusion and exclusion. Priya Parker, who many of you may have read her book, The Art of Gathering, has written, if everyone is invited, no one is invited, in the sense of being truly held by the group. By closing the door, she writes, you create the room. So today I want us to think more deeply about event planning decisions that we make, which maybe you are thinking or not thinking about, that really help create your event's room, so to speak, and how we can be intentional and thoughtful about how and for whom we are creating that space. I'm really looking forward to learning from our speakers about how we can build this kind of intentionality into our event planning. So first, we'll hear from Professor Michelle Murphy, historian of technoscience and the 2021 program chair for what was the largest virtual gathering of the Society for the Social Studies of Science. Murphy's going to share with us some framework for evaluating how to determine the appropriateness of a tool for the particularity of a community. And then we're going to hear from former Event Fund grantee, Janina Bellina Saibene, on taking language diversity into account in an international conference. And last but not least, another former Event Fund grantee, Kelsey Bressman, will share her experience developing and applying guidelines for community participation. So with that, and with a lot of pleasure, I want to invite Murphy to start us off. We will be taking one question after each speaker's presentation, but we'll hold the rest of the questions until the Q&A. So over to you, Murphy.
Fabulous. Hi, everybody. Thank you, Angela. As I said in the chat, I'm coming to you from Toronto or Toronto. I'm going to share screen. How's that working? Awesome. So Angela asked me to talk about some of the ethics and deliberations that went into organizing with others the 4S 2021 virtual conference, which had about over 3,000 participants, was really a challenge. And to do that, I wanted to kind of walk you through kind of some of the deliberations that led to the way we came to that conference and thinking about how to run a virtual conference. So I am a director of a Indigenous-led, Indigenous majority lab at the University of Toronto that works on environmental data justice. And we try to think about how to bring good relations, Indigenous feminist ethics, and our responsibilities to Indigenous jurisdiction in everything we do. And so our lab and all our work begins, this is just a little taste of it. We have a very elaborate value statement, lab manual, that's a living document that guides everything we do. And in fact, when we started our lab, the first 6 months of it was just coming together around values, protocols, how are we gonna like meet, how are we gonna share food, how are we gonna solve conflicts, all these kinds of things. And so this work really is an example of what kind of influences all this other work that we do around organizing conferences and events. So it's kind of a deep process of bringing ethics and good relations to our work. And our work is mostly about this place called Canada's Chemical Valley, where the majority of Canada's petrochemicals are refined. And there are some 57 facilities, and they happen to be on the territory of Aamjiwnaang First Nation. So our lab is academics and community members that work together around questions of data justice and environmental justice. And so we work with a lot of bad data, a lot of bad platforms, a lot of bad monitors. And when I say bad, I mean that they're built through the values of colonialism, the values of erasing responsibility, the values of violence, the values of inaccessibility. And so what we do a lot is try to work in relationship to these bad data relations and build technologies, approaches to bringing good relations, relations guided by community values, Anishinaabe values, or Indigenous feminist values to our data practices. So, for example, we built an app that tries to do something different with data and make a platform that's built with and by, with and for community. And in doing that, we see data and platforms as full of responsibilities. So it's not just that the polluter has responsibilities or the government, the corporation, the community, but we kind of see this, the data, our practices, our meetings, everything is full of responsibilities. And this is when we say relations, we don't just mean abstract relations, we always mean ethical relations. So this connects to, I think, what everyone here thinks about, which is in some version, data justice. And how can we connect our commitments to data justice to the mundane aspects of having meetings and doing virtual meetings and picking tools and platforms and practices. And so I want to walk through some of the ways that we've been doing that at the Technoscience Research Unit and our lab. So we are guided beyond data justice by practices of Indigenous data governance and justice. And one of the beautiful things about Indigenous data governance and justice is that it looks not just at how to make data accessible, but that the governance of data and platforms and the ways that we come together and govern and take care of each other are part of our data and platform practices. I also want to point out something like this, the Feminist Data Manifesto, that highlights that our ethical responsibilities in thinking about these things also are about what we don't want to be reproducing, what we don't want to keep doing, and not just like how do we add practices to what we're doing. And then I want to make a shout out to an environmental data governance initiative. I know Kelsey's going to be talking about this, but I learned a lot from this group about platforms and ethics and practices, and particularly my colleague Dawn Walker, who was one of the co-organizers with me on the 4S 2021 conference. So going back to this thing of starting with values, right? Thinking about our meetings, our coming together, our gatherings as starting with a set of shared values. So we really have been shaped by the Allied Media Conference and its practices of what it calls radical hospitality. So what does it mean to often offer a kind of hospitality that's not just about the welcome, but about thinking about the hospitality as an invitation to participants to join you in making a gathering work according to different kinds of ethics, and to make a gathering work in relationship to the world you want to be building. So it's not just the host welcoming, but it's the host welcoming you into participating in worlding another world together in a gathering. And this was something before I did 4S 2021, I was organizing the Native American Indigenous Studies Association conference, which is about the same size and is also global. It was supposed to happen at the beginning of COVID, and it got canceled after years of organizing. But it had its theme about being in good relation, as how we're going to, that the conference practices, as well as the theme of the conference, was building good relation. And particularly this was in connection to Indigenous land and being in Toronto. And we invited everyone to think about coming to join us in Toronto and doing so, highlighting their practices of consent. What does it mean to gather in a good way? And how do we show care to one another? This was our conference call. So this work really influenced us in making the 4S 2021 meeting. Our organizing committee was Indigenous, Black, and queer people, included faculty and graduate students. We really wanted to think about inviting all our colleagues to join us in the question of good relations in relationship to technology. And that we were going to try our best to manifest that in the organization, but invite all the participants to join us in that during hard times, knowing that it's hard to make good technical relations, hard to make a good gathering during hard times, and hard times are ongoing and unevenly distributed. So we had many committees. And one of them was a platform committee, and this was led by Don Walker, who I mentioned previously, who's really such a genius on the kind of practices of radical hospitality and coming together in technical projects. And so we wanted, we had to look for what kind of platform would we hire? Were we just going to do Zoom? We were going to do YouTube? How were we going to do it? And so we started with a set of values, right? The first was the theme of the conference, that we needed to be explicitly talking about and sharing the challenge of trying to be in good relations around technology, knowing it was going to be bumpy, but it was a horizon we were trying to figure out. That it had to be accessible to global participation. So that's time zones, as well as unevennesses in income and currency exchange. Then we really wanted to take care of people. So what does it mean to, or create context that we could care for each other? So looking for platforms that allows socialization and informality to exist. Looking for ways of bringing care practices to the platform. Looking for virtual tools that allow people to work collaboratively or come together across different time zones. That was another kind of technical thing. And then thinking about accessibility multidimensionally. So we can have questions about disability and accessibility, but accessibility can also be about, do you have childcare? Where, like what constraints and obstacles are there for you to be joining this meeting, experiencing exchanges of care and exchanges of knowledge? And then we also wanted to make a toolkit for how to come together beyond the virtual. So we also did that. So like, having the code of conduct here, we had an ethical policy that is elaborated from past 4S ethical policies. And importantly, I think for an ethics policy, it's not just asking people to come together in a good way, but actually having the ways you're going to put that in action. So we did that. We had 200 volunteers helping us with this. Then we had very elaborate documentation practices. And I think this is another important part of, not just having the instructions for how to use a platform, but sharing the deliberations, sharing these detailed procedures around ethics or care. I think about how Angela opened us today was a kind of example of this with the document. And it's really, I think, an important part of like feminist and radical hospitality and digital practice justice. So just keep working on these documentation practices. So here's kind of an example of some of the things that we had. There's a lot. I think Angela put the link in the document for people that are interested in seeing our successes and challenges with documentation. And then we also really, in terms of taking care of one another, tried to make in our platform places of rest. So we actually collaborated with the virtual care lab to have a kind of rest, nap, dream space in the conference where you could go to, as well as instructions elsewhere for how to form little private spaces to have quiet time together as one or two people and so on. So we really tried to think about how do we take care of each other in virtual space and rest. So I think about how Angela started us with breathing, but thinking about building that into the platform explicitly. And then, you know, like lots of events, we struggle with the technicalities of accessibility. You hire a platform, you might use Zoom, it does some things and not others. And we're almost always working with a budget where the amount of money we could spend on accessibility is kind of infinite, but is always actually super finite. So we formed a committee of people who mostly work in the field of crypt technoscience, like how awesome that we have specialists in crypt technoscience in our field who can form a committee. And they help to guide us through a practice of seeing accessibility as a distributed responsibility. The hosts have a bunch of responsibility, but so do all the participants. And that's how, and in providing the support for participants to join us in accessibility, we might get closer to it. So we took this practice of accessibility. I'll share these slides so you can see some of the sources that we drew on. And here Zoe Wool was really helpful in helping us do this. And so if we're going to have distributed accessibility, we have to have training, we have to have surveys to find out about what people's needs are. We have to provide materials beforehand and during, and supports around achieving distributed accessibility. So of course you would do captioning or things like that, but there's so much more to do. And it's a challenge. Like I find speaking slow something I always have to keep reminding myself of around accessibility. So this is also another kind of aspect to the platform, like connecting the technical with our actual social relations with one another. And then because like I think this event, people were joining from many time zones and also had like childcare issues because it was the like height of COVID. And so we did this thing that we kind of made up called participatory scheduling, where instead of as program chairs scheduling all the papers, we had an elaborate process of inviting participants to give us their suggestions about the best times for their assembly and try to get the first or second choice for everyone, which involved then creating a conference that starts so super early in the day and goes so super late at night. And then doing things like recording to make asynchronous coming together possible. But beyond recording, to pick a platform that people could join, see the recording later and continue the commentary and discussion asynchronously after. So participatory scheduling was a part of trying to just create this accessibility and relationship to place. And then the next thing we did for a kind of multi-dimensional accessibility is equity and registration. And here we looked around at lots of different conferences to see how they did equity in affordability. And thinking about people's precarious employment or status. So in this case, because it's academic, whether they're students or postdocs or precariously unemployed or employed, and then people who have secure employment, like professors and particularly tenure track professors. And we really tried to put the burden of supporting the conference on people with secure employment and high wages, and redistribute access that way. We also, anyone who volunteered got free registration, and anyone who wrote to us with a financial need also got free registration. So beyond this system, there was also a lot of just making sure anyone who needed to be there was there. So in addition to status, we also did a lot of research about regions and incomes and currency exchanges. So people had to pay in US dollars. And so we created these 3 different regions that would have different price points for registration to try to make it accessible, with the invitation that let us know, we will reduce or give you the registration if this is inaccessible for you. So the interesting thing about this is this helped to make our event bigger, and we ended up making more of a profit than the previous years of events that we had data for. So there's often a sensibility that having equity in registration and fees would lead to less income, but we were able to have greater income actually with equity of fees. So that was a real fascinating lesson, and like a project of really taking care at the level of finance, in addition to like platform, like there's a lot of technicalities in that too. So just to kind of end, and going back to values, you know, after we finished the conference, and Mock-up has probably seen this, we wrote a gigantic report, you know, detailing everything. And we have a huge Google folder with all of our deliberations and meetings and minutes that we passed on. So when we do this work, it's interesting to think about how we're making future information bundles or digital bundles for each other as we kind of keep learning how to come together in our digital practices as they change, the digital technologies change, and our hard times continue, but the conditions of our hard times change. So here I really look at something like Jennifer Wegemoan's book, thinking about digital bundles and how our work in the present is about thinking about ourselves as ancestors to a future. And thinking about Karen Reckley, my colleague here at University of Toronto, who does Indigenous digital hub work, and how can we think about this ongoing practice of passing forward our ethical care relations. So when we imagine this, like when we imagine our events, we have, I think, a lot of pre-documentation. And it's interesting to think about, you know, what information do we need to keep sharing like this event here to help our communities keep enduring, healing, gathering, making beautiful worlds? And what kind of digital practices do we need to keep passing on for these ongoing hard times? So a lot of beautiful care and effort went into the Forest 2021 conference, but the platform crashed at a certain point. It got hacked, actually, by, I don't know who, but like we had hacking attacks on it. We had, you know, so many problems around like people struggling to share their screens. There was so many challenges. And so, you know, in the end, there's this kind of humbleness that you put in all this work, and what we know is we're not actually reaching the horizon of like the accomplishment of the full good relations, but we're bringing some of that harm reduction, passing on some of the digital bundles, and there's something really beautiful in that, I think. And so, thanks. I look forward to hearing from other people's practices.
Thank you so much, Murphy. That was really incredible. We'll maybe take one question if anyone has one that they want to ask straight away. Otherwise, we will continue to our next speaker. There's also a section in the document where you can add your questions. So as they come to you, feel free to throw them in there. Okay, let's then invite, I believe we have Shani next to speak. And I think Shani will share her screens.
Yeah, I will try. Let's see. Are you seeing my slides? Okay. I have a version in Spanish of this slide if you want to go through this, and the link is on the Google Doc. And I agree with a lot of things that Murphy just say, and I have some of this experience that I hope we can share. And I'm going to focus in language, because if you watch the captioning right now, even if I speak slow, you are going to find a lot on how these algorithms interpret my accent. So. And I add to the title cognitive justice, because for people who are not a native speaker of the language of the conference, international conference that usually is English, it's really hard work to be able to participate and to take advantage of all that happens in an event. So my first slide, if I can. Okay, it's not advancing, right? Let's see. Well, you can see there in that. Okay, let's go into see in this in this way. The chance of being part of a conference, the opportunities are not the same for everybody. And most of the time that has to be with their quality as a professional of academic or industrial practitioner. So this phrase that I'm showing you here was said by Ivan, Paola, and Nelio, who were part of Metadocencia, one of the grantees of the CSNS. And we don't want to leave anyone of the role, but the road is made by us. So it is to us to make the road free of barriers. And I really love this idea that it's not only the responsibility of the host, but the entire community to work on this. And for me, the step one that you have to do, Murphy also said this, is to have a diverse team from the beginning, building the conference. The experience from the people who are usually part of these excluded groups can be replaced by second-hand experience or good intentions. So you need to listen to the people that you want they are part of your conference or your event or your community. You need to have them on the team and making decisions. You have to give them power. So about language, one of the steps that I will say you need to do is define a series of official languages. That is going to be different because of the country or the region you are. This example is for LATINAR, for Latin America. The conference is trilingual in English, in Spanish and Portuguese. Spanish and Portuguese because it's the language we speak, and English because it's the language that allows us to be in contact with the international community. And it's also work as lingua franca between us when we can understand each other. you need to allow abstract and revision on those languages. So the example I'm giving you here is the Congress of Agroinformatics in Argentina, was in English and Spanish from the beginning. And then in 2016, when I became the president, we also add Portuguese and we translate everything, the call for papers, the email for invitations, the review system, the feedback to authors, and the people who review are native speakers of the language that the authors send the work. It is a lot of work. Yes, you can get the people to do this. You can find these people to do this in the language of the author. And of course, we allow people present in their native language. Communicate officially in those languages. So some examples here are the frequently asked questions for user 2022. The official languages are French, Spanish, and English. And we have all this content, this official content in the 3 languages. The platform for Latinar, which is Slack, have the name of the channels in Portuguese and Spanish. And the live tweet from the official account of user 2021 was in Spanish and in English. So 2 people working with TweetDeck have the access to the Twitter account, and they tweet live in both languages during the keynote. Provide subtitles in those languages. And in the examples we have, for user 2021, we have live captioning by people, not automatic one, and we have translation also in the caption form. So you can see the talk and go to a link to have this text that accompany the keynote. And in the other example, the keynote was pre-recorded. We upload the talk, we use the automatic caption, we edit to fix all the mistakes, we translate this, and we add the Spanish version of these subtitles. The other one is provide translation in those language by audio. So this works really, really well. And in this kind of event, this example was a finish of the book club where we invite the author. The author speak English, and most of the people who come to the book club speak Spanish. So every single person can choose which language they want to listen and to speak. And we have a translator who do the work to speak in both languages. So you can see here, you can choose the original audio was a Spanglish things, and then you can listen in English or you can listen in Spanish. Everyone can participate in the language they are more comfortable. Have program content in those languages. This is also a way to show that you have scientists, members of your community with quality content to share in the native language. So for example, here we have tutorials. We provide tutorials in Latinar, in Portuguese, in English, and Spanish, at user in French, in Spanish, and in English. And for example, this one was provided in 5 languages, in Polish, Turkish, Vietnamese, English, and Spanish. And the keynotes also in these languages. So it's not always all the important content only in English. So for the Congress of Agroinformatics, we have 2 keynotes, one in Spanish, one in Portuguese. And the Q&A is also in any language that people want to speak, and we translate the questions and the answers. So the keynote answer in their language, and we translate this content. So the ideal, for me, the ideal is that anyone can present in their native language, because you are more comfortable doing that, it's less work, with a translation, with subtitles, and if you can, do it by a person, not for an automatic system. Other options, allow to send a video in the person native language with a script in English. So when I have to do that, I record myself, I upload to YouTube, I use the automatic subtitles, I download, I fix, and translate using DeepL, and then I upload the English subtitles. So I have my talks in both languages. Or allow to send it a video in the person native language, and the host, the organization, add the subtitles. CarpentryCon, for example, do this year. So do these things work? Yes, works a lot. I going to be more willing to participate in an event that allow me to do less work and to be more comfortable and to be myself. I know the same person in English than in Spanish. It is incredible, but it is like that. And some of these things, as Liz say, aren't unreasonable, too expensive or too difficult, but need intentional action. So we want to do this. If we don't want to do it, we can speak nice, but we are not going to do it. So yeah, that's all for my side. Thank you. I'm sorry for the screen share.
Speaking of technical glitches, I think I froze. Thank you so much, Shani, in case anyone didn't hear me. That was really, really insightful. Maybe if in case anyone has one question that they can't wait to ask, I'll give a small pause for that. But otherwise, I think we can continue and we will have a really robust Q&A. So last but not least, of course, Kelsey, over to you.
Thank you, Angela. And let's see how screen share works for me. I am really honored to have been invited to do this, and in such company too. It's really lovely to see all of you here. So Angela asked me to talk about codes of conduct or community participation guidelines. And I wouldn't think of myself as an expert in this space, but I was really excited when this Code for Science and Society grant included special call outs to working with codes of conduct, working with trying to make a highly accessible event, not just good virtual events, but good virtual events in the sense of accessible to anybody. You will notice that I am a fast talker and I will try to tone that down, but please let me know. I will see your chat pop up if you say, hey, slow down, I can't understand you. So I wanted to talk about just this one experience that we had through this invitation to work with our code of conduct at the Environmental Data and Governance Initiative. We already had a good code of conduct. And Murphy called out Dawn Walker, and she was one of the people who was originally working with the Environmental Data and Governance Initiative, hosting these big in-person events. There were other folks, Patrick Connolly, who were involved with building really good participation guidelines at the beginning. So when sorry, there's someone at the door. So when we came around to this code of conduct for CS&S grant, one of the things that was really interesting was, well, why would you rewrite a code of conduct that is already good? And I like to think about this. There's a story by Jorge Luis Borges, and it's one of my favorites. And it's called Pierre Menard, author of the Quixote. And in the story, there's a man, Pierre Menard, who reads Cervantes' Don Quixote story, and he loves it so much that he decides to change the entire rest of his life as a modern man not living when Cervantes did, to try to be the kind of person who could produce that work exactly as it was from scratch. And he does not succeed, but he succeeds in writing a few lines. And the story argues that because he succeeded in writing those few lines, the lines that he wrote actually meant a lot more than when Cervantes wrote them. Because what it did was it changed him to write it. And I want, when you think about codes of conduct and why you write them, I want you to, if you only have the capacity at the moment to copy and paste a code of conduct from somewhere, scan it, modify it a little bit, make sure it works well, that's a good minimum. But if you can think about how you can transform yourself and your organization through the creation or recreation of participation guidelines, I want you to think about what values that creates in you, in your organization, and how you're going to feel when you ask other people to use your codes of conduct. So I'm going to show you a little bit about how we did our process and what we ended up with. But, you know, you each should be your own Pierre Menard, and you won't produce the same lines of Cervantes as I do. And so I want you to see this only as an example and think more about how it feels to write a code of conduct that really is meaningful for you and for your communities. So I wanted to give a shout out to a few things. A really big one is Leslie Alanis, who we were able to hire through the CS&S funding for a period of several months, who was my co-conspirator, especially in doing multilingual event hosting, as well as doing this code of conduct. You can see in the background, it's pretty light, I know, but we used a mural board that she put together, which invited our entire community to look at different evaluations of codes of conduct that we found on the Geek Feminism Wiki, which I super recommend because it isn't just a list of codes of conduct, but it's got a lot of different like check marks on, does it have this, does it have that? So evaluating what you think is most important to highlight for your communities. And we were able to get this feedback from different people of, well, what did you like about this? What did you not like about this particular code of conduct? What can you imagine being different? And I want to call out a couple of things that we thought were really valuable for us for having a code of conduct. So we wanted it to be meaningful. We wanted it to be not just what is a code of conduct, how do we want people to behave? We wanted to make sure, what we noticed when we looked at all these different codes of conduct was we really liked the ones where it had a positive statement of purpose. It wasn't just, don't do this, don't do that. It was, here is why we want to create this kind of space. And therefore, these are the guidelines for participation that are under it. We wanted it to be clear. I would say that a lot of times people engage with codes of conduct in this really binary way, where they say, oh, you broke the code of conduct, now you're going to get kicked out now and forever. And that's a way that people end up not using codes of conduct. And I'll revisit this point later. And we wanted it to be usable. So on the internal side, so that was kind of the external side of, you know, people don't report because they're worried it's going to be too big of a deal. On the internal side, when you receive a report, that can be like, oh no, we really screwed up. What do we do now? So we needed it to be something that we could look at and say, oh, somebody told us something about how to improve our engagement with community. That's great. What do we do next? And have some ideas already set up so that we could kind of live in that kind of emotional moment of receiving a report, but also do something very productive with it. This is you don't have to read this whole slide, but I wanted to break down a little bit of what we put in our code of conduct. And this is, again, I think Angela will send in the chat a link to our code of conduct so you can look at it in full if you want to use it. But I kind of wanted to just call out the parts of it. So we wanted the what, the who, and the how. So again, those statements of positive purpose. What is it that brings us into community? What are our values that we are trying to build by having this code of conduct? Then this who is really interesting. So we have the severity scale, which I'll talk about in the next slide. That is kind of lets people rate what sort of response they want to have. And then also who to contact in various scenarios, because it's not going to be the same if we're in an in-person event, if you're somebody who spends time on our Slack over the period of months or years, if you're at a virtual event that you're hosting, if you're at a virtual event that you're just speaking at, you might have really different needs in terms of who to contact and how. And then there's the how, and I'll show you a little bit more about this, but we have in our code of conduct a number of potential scenarios, and they're not the rules, they are sort of guideline ideas of when something happens, here's how the reporter might look at something, and here's how the person who is receiving the report might respond. And it leaves a lot open for negotiation, negotiation is kind of the wrong word, but to navigate through that sort of scenario, because it's going to be really unique to the situation and the people involved every single time. To that end, we also began to build a conflict resolution toolkit based on the concept of restorative justice. And the biggest idea in that, in my opinion, is that when you have something that becomes a conflict or that becomes a disagreement that you need to seek resolution on, what it could ideally do is help everybody involved grow and learn. and become a better community out of it. So that's the goal of our code of conduct, is to help us grow. I wanted to go a little bit further into the severity scale concept. This is to combat directly the idea of the binary, you know, I don't want to invoke the code of conduct because I don't want it to get somebody to get kicked out. This is interesting because it's subjective. So we ask that people report using this scale, where number 1 is, I need something, I need help right now, I need you to do something. And 4 is, I don't even know if this is a code of conduct violation, but I felt kind of funny about it. One thing that we do in all of our events when we remember to, is we call this out. We might not put it in these terms necessarily, but when we have events, we have a call out that says, hey, the actual point of this event is not just to make most people reasonably comfortable. The point of this event is that we need each of the most individual voices in this room to feel not just included, but welcomed, invited to be here. And if there is anything that we said or that someone said or that happened in terms of the technology or anything about the way that this was done, and you felt just a little bit weird about it, we want you to come forward and tell us, because we would like to do better, because we are here because you are here. So that's what the hope with the severity scale is. This is some potential scenarios that you can look at. So you can see that there might be really different responses on if somebody uses racial slurs in an event chat. Maybe that's one of those really good binary moments where you say, yeah, nope, they're out. But you might have a couple other things happen, right? You might have 2 people, you might have 2 edgy people even from my org disagreeing vehemently on an issue in public in front of a bunch of other people. Now, that's not necessarily a code of conduct violation, but it might make people feel uncomfortable. So how could you deal with that? And this is suggesting some ideas, but there are other ways that you could deal with it depending on how it felt. Or poor choice of language, right? Like I've been at tech conferences where somebody throughout their whole presentation only used male gendered pronouns to refer to developers. I've seen that turn into a Twitter storm, and that's not necessarily what you want. It might be what you want. It might be the right response, but there are different ways that you can handle this. And so having a suggestion of what if we tried it this way? What if this was a way we did it? Might help us have a path that helps everybody get to the sorts of learning and the sorts of results that they're looking for. I wanted to call out some of the challenges. So I would say there are a couple of things. CS&S requested that we do, or they suggested in the guidelines of building this sort of code of conduct virtual events. One of the things that was suggested was transparency reporting. We have not found that to work well for us. We tried to implement it, and I think it's really cool. So if you haven't heard of this, sometimes I think PyCon does a really good job of this, where they list after their conference, they say how many reports they got from the code of conduct, and then they give some anonymized version of what the resolution looked like, which I think is really cool. For us, it doesn't really make sense. And maybe there's some part of the idea that makes sense, but we tend to be in a pretty small community. And if we were to do transparency reporting, you know, most of the time it'd be nothing happened, and we'd release a whole report that says nothing happened. And so that's kind of weird. That's its own kind of information issue. And then other times if something did happen, I think everybody would know who it was. So that's something to be conscious about, careful about, and it was really interesting to explore that idea. We also have a lot of events. So a conference once a year with hundreds of people is very different from, you know, 20 events throughout the year with 5 to 15 people. Anonymity. This is one we have not figured out how to navigate super well. So like if I'm speaking and I'm the person you're supposed to report code of conduct violations to, and I said something that you're like really uncomfortable about, what are you going to do? So we try to make sure that there are multiple people who you can respond to. We've also tried having an anonymous email that goes to a panel of people. That's been quite hard to maintain. And again, our community is pretty small. So this is another one that's very hard to navigate at our scale. Actual use. I can say that our conflict resolution toolkit has been brought out before, but our code of conduct, we haven't really had anyone say, hey, I had a problem. I need you to implement the code of conduct with me. And I don't know if that's a challenge or a problem per se, because we tend to invite people who are very much on board with our values. That's who we're mostly having events with. But it also could indicate a problem. It could mean that this has been still too intimidating or too complicated, or this is a pretty weird code of conduct, so they didn't know what to do with it. So it's worth noticing that and thinking about, well, how can we test out and make sure and run this code of conduct with people? And that's not something that we've got resolved. There are some things that are working. I mentioned earlier this call out that says, look, we have a code of conduct, you know, it's going to be pasted in the chat, but the most important thing here is that everyone here is very welcome. And that we really want you to tell us if you are not feeling fully welcome. I've had really positive feedback from doing that in various spaces, including when I bring my own code of conduct to other conferences. Practicality of use has been great. It's really cool to be able to see, like, just as a reference, oh yeah, I was uncomfortable in that meeting, here's what we might do. And some of these restorative justice concepts of thinking through how to take a challenging resolution, a challenging conflict and move through it together based on our shared goals and values and our individual goals and boundaries with a conflict. That's all I've got for you, and I'm sorry if I went over 8 minutes. I might have, but I really appreciate you all listening. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Kelsey. I think that's really helpful to go from both the high level values and then to walk us into the very specific challenges. I think is really helpful for people to think together with you on. So we've got about 25 minutes as planned, which is incredible because my events always run over. So we have 25 minutes for some questions. And I see that we have a few in the chat document, but maybe before we go there, I will leave a pause for folks who want to speak their questions.